Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome each of you to the 6th Annual Voices in American Art presentation. When the collection started this series, it had a twofold aim. First, to bring prominent professional arts leaders to Spartanburg to introduce them to our remarkable and very creative community. The second goal was to engage us, that's all of you here tonight, our neighbors, our city's leaders, our college students, and the art makers of the community in conversation, helping us to stay up to date with the wider narrative of the arts. Tonight marks Voices' return to the Chapman Cultural Center, and I'd like to express our appreciation and gratitude to the Board of Trustees of Chapman, to Jennifer Evans and her remarkable staff for being so welcoming and hospitable to us. Now, here in the South, there is a tried and true proverb, a bit of wisdom borne out by our distinguished visitors' presence here. That proverb is this: all roads lead home. All roads lead home. In this context, home can be a place, a group of people, or simply a sensibility. For me and for Tuliza Fleming, home goes back more than a generation and begins about an hour and a half from here, up the road, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I grew up in Morganton, North Carolina. The population then was about 8,000 people. Tuliza's father, John, himself now a renowned cultural historian and institutional director, also grew up there. John was an exceptional student, and his interest was in history. My father, Ned Pfeiffer, though not by profession an academic historian, had published articles in the North Carolina Historical Review and in the Journal of Southern History. John knew this, and as a very young college student, called my father and asked if he would meet with him. Meet they did at our home, and from that meeting, a lifelong relationship was forged, centered around a love of place and a love of history. Morganton's schools were segregated at that time, so my siblings and I only knew John through our father. But after my father's death, my brother Edward made contact with Dr. John Fleming as he blazed a stellar career path and made occasional visits back home to Morganton. Now, I am privileged to be here welcoming a younger Dr. Fleming, John's daughter, Tuliza. Dr. Fleming's impressive credentials and curatorial innovations are noted in tonight's program, and I know you will enjoy reading about them. Last May, George and I were able to see Tuliza's thoughtful, nuanced, powerful work when we visited the National Museum of African American History and Culture in D.C. Seeing what she had been part of creating and our experience at the museum itself have been life-altering experiences. I encourage each of you to make your own visit there, and tonight to join me in making Dr. Tuliza Fleming not only feel welcomed, but at home. Dr. Fleming. I'm not going to say that
Well, good evening. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out on this rainy evening So that even makes it more special. Susu talked about her relationship with my father, but let me tell you a little bit about how I heard about Susan and George Dean Johnson. I have a woman who works with me, Katrina Hill, and she was doing some research for me about different collections in the United States, and she came across this collection on the website. And she says, oh, there's this beautiful collection. They collect Southern artists, and they have a significant number of African American artists in this collection. Have you heard of them? And I said, no, I haven't heard of them. And we asked around, and I said, you know who might know? My father. He worked in South Carolina, and if he doesn't know, he knows someone else who does. And indeed he did, and he talked about Edward and how wonderful he was to him when he was working and beginning his work on the museum in South Carolina of the International African American Museum. And he put us in touch with Susu, who graciously invited me and my father to come and visit. And I talk about this visit all the time. It was amazing, the generosity of her hosting us. She introduced me all around the city. I learned wonderful things about her school and the initiatives of various neighborhoods. I met really lovely people who were philanthropists here and stayed in a great bed and breakfast. And we had a wonderful time. And when I came back, I just talked about this town, talked about the people, and about that beautiful collection that I saw, and the wonderful staff, particularly Lynn and Sarah, who were so generous with their time. And you know, Lynn has hung in there with me because it's very difficult to bring a person from the Smithsonian down on a sponsorship because it is federal, and there must be about 10 people who need to sign off before you're allowed to go anywhere. And she hung in there, and we got it done. And now I'm staying at their beautiful hotel, which I will also brag about when I get home, and talk about the old friends I've met and the new friends I met today at lunch, and the wonderful students, college students and high school students that I spoke with today, who were very engaged, and we had a wonderful conversation. So I have a lot to talk about when I come back to tell my friends and colleagues. So a little bit about myself. I am a curator of American art at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. As Susu said, I am the daughter of a museum director, which people call the museum baby, which means, as I was telling the students this afternoon, that when you have parents who are scholars and don't have a lot of money, so you can't afford babysitters, they drag those children to every museum event that you have. And my father used to bribe us in terms of making us go and behave with cookies. So we can eat all the cookies that they had at the reception if we went and put on a good face. So for a long time, I did not want to go into museums. But then I went to Spelman College and took some art courses, and I've always loved art. And met a few people, David Driscoll, who is a professor emeritus at University of Maryland, and a few of my art professors who really encouraged me to go into the field. And I decided to become an art curator, mostly because I heard David Driscoll speak while I was at Spelman. And I followed him to University of Maryland, where I received my master's and PhD, done a lot of internships at the National Gallery and various museums at the Smithsonian. Went back home because I ran out of money. My fellowship was over, so I had to move back home. I got a job at the Dayton Art Institute as Curator of American Art. Decided to finish my dissertation, and the second job I applied to was at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So to tell you a little bit about the museum was established by an act of Congress in 2003, and we just recently opened 2.5 years ago in September 2016. I was one of the first 4 curators hired, and I've been there for 11.5 years, and I started in 2007. So when we started, we had 1 work of art and one painting and 1 print. So when I started, there were about 20 employees. Now we have, at this point, 250, but I imagine now it's about 275 employees. We are the 19th Smithsonian Museum and the last museum that's going to be built on the mall. So the museum is 400,000 square feet. It's located on a 5-acre plot next to the National Monument. Before I go on, how many people have been to the museum? Woo! That's wonderful. Now, how many people want to go? I love it. I love it. So we have approximately 3,000 objects on display. We have 40,000 objects in the collection, and it's growing every single day. So right now we have approximately 3 million visitors a year. Now this is interesting because the only reason why we have only 3 million visitors is people stay on average 4 to 6 hours when they visit. And some people come back 2 days in a row. And we have had time tickets, so it's difficult for people to come to the museum sometimes, but that's because people don't leave, which is great. And when you reach capacity, you can't allow people to come in. So when we first opened, we expected to do time tickets for about 1 to 3 months. We are now 2.5 years in, and we're still doing time tickets, which is unheard of at the Smithsonian. I don't think it's ever happened for more than a year, which lets you know how important this museum is and how much this history is needed. It's one of the few places, or not the only place, where you can learn about the history of African Americans in this country, from the first Africans to come over to the present day, and all aspects of our culture, and also how African American experience is not only a fundamental American experience, but how we shaped who we are as a country and how we have influenced who people are across the globe. We have 11 inaugural exhibitions, and they are grouped into 3 broad categories: history, community, and culture. So, again, when I started, I was the 3rd out of 4 curators hired in 2007, and now we have 19 curators. So what people don't understand, and I think a lot of people assume, is that when we opened, we're going to get all kind of objects from other Smithsonian museums. And that's not the case. Each Smithsonian institution, each Smithsonian museum operates as a separate museum. They have a separate board, they have separate staff, fundraising agencies, and collections. So if we wanted to bring an artwork or an object in from another Smithsonian, we have to ask for a loan just like any other museum. So we had to do everything from scratch. And we really didn't begin collecting until 2006. And when we opened in 2016, we actually had to stop collecting probably in 2015. And we did not have any real money to collect. We're a Smithsonian institution. We're expected to have a Smithsonian world-class collection. But we only had about $1.2 million a year. Sometimes that was as low as $900,000 a year for the entire museum. And when you tell art people that, they're shocked, because you have artworks going for $100 million. And we had to spread that around all areas of the museum. And we were under a capital campaign, so our fundraisers can only raise money for the building, and this building cost about $750,000. So the vast majority of objects we were collected were donations. And I cannot emphasize enough how to collect 40,000 objects in that short space of time through the generosity of others and how people really believed in our mission. And we were unproven. Nobody knew what this museum was going to be like, but people knew how important it was going to be. And people were trying to get a presence on the mall, documenting the history of African Americans, their sacrifices, their struggles, their commitment to this country for 100 years. And so it was so important for people of all ethnicities, all backgrounds, to contribute to this museum, and is making it what it is today. So, as I said before, we have 3 major categories in the museum. So almost everybody starts from the bottom. So you walk into our main entrance hall, and then you go 3 stories underground, and you start with slavery and freedom. Now, one of the things our esteemed director, Lonnie Bunch, tasked us with as curators is to not only tell the expected story, but tell the unexpected story. So I think that when we read history books and look at documentaries, we see the who's who and these main figures. But one of our goals was to talk about the people that you don't know, that you've never heard of, the stories about people's lives who made a difference just by surviving, right? So our Slavery and Freedom exhibition not only talks about the history of slavery, but how people created their own sense of freedom, even if they couldn't escape bondage, and then people who were able to, and were able to go back and bring their relatives up to the underground world or purchase their relatives and really forge a life for themselves. Our second exhibition on the next floor is Defending Freedom, Defining Freedom, in the Era of Segregation. Now, I think popular cultural belief is that segregation was a 20th century phenomenon. But as many of you know, that during slavery there was no such thing as segregation. There were no black pockets that existed on your own. You could not have these black free populations. You had to move up north. And this fight to end segregation, to define your freedom, started after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. And so we wanted to broaden that concept and tell that unknown story and broaden what this idea is to be free and to integrate in American society and to be seen as a full human being. Our last history exhibition is A Changing America, 1968 and beyond. And this is my generation and this idea that once received, once integration happened, what's next? How do people navigate in a world where I would say people think everything is okay, the fight is over, and as we know, the fight is not over. We're still really dealing with some historical difficulties, but we're also dealing with some really major triumphs. And so this exhibition ends with the election of President Obama, and I think a lot of people thought that was it. But as we know, that's not it, and there is a next chapter that will be history continues, and our history at this museum will continue to document our future moving forward. Now, once you come up above the underground section of the museum, we have this idea of community. There are many ways from which you can define a community. And we have several exhibitions. One of the first is Making a Way Out of No Way. And this really sort of talks about, in some ways, how institutions dealt with some of that history that we discussed in the history gallery. So what happens when you're not allowed to go to what somebody said at lunch today, was it a predominantly white institution? What happens if you do that? You go to a historically black institution, as I did when I went to Spelman College, and these schools were created when we weren't allowed to go to mainstream popular institutions. How do you get represented in the press? Well, you start your own newspapers. You want to be part of a fraternity and sorority. You start black fraternities and sororities. If you want to bank, you couldn't even get a bank account, so you have black banks. So this exhibition is really exploring how African Americans created institutions that are necessary for every American, but were denied in mainstream culture. The Power of Place. This is really an innovative exhibition for me because people talk about this idea of the black community. And in reality, there was never such thing as a black community. I think black people were always connected because of racial segregation and racial discrimination. But we've always been different people. Even since we stepped foot in this country, we came from different areas of West Africa, and different cultures. And people brought certain cultures to certain places because they might be really good at working in indigo or tobacco or rice in particular. So There are always been different cultures, just like if you go to New Orleans, you have a very distinct culture than you do if you live in Vermont. And what this exhibition talks about is how varied cultures are, not only about region, but in time. So you have, and what you see on your left is actually interactive, where you can look at where your people are from and learn a little bit more about that. But you can also look at a glimpse of life in various areas. So what you see on your right is a porch from Martha's Vineyard. And so a lot of people don't know that Martha's Vineyard is a place where upper middle class people have vacationed for, I guess we're going on 2 centuries now, and a lot of people didn't know that there were upper middle class Black people with vacation homes, and Black or white people. And I think it's important to show that there are various communities with various cultures, with various histories, and really debunk that idea of one Black community. Double victory, African American in the military experience. Now, double victory is definitely a World War II term, so it's this idea of people fighting for freedom and against fascism abroad while still experiencing that at home. I think one interesting thing was when African Americans went abroad in World War I, they came back and were lynched. And I'm going to ask everyone to turn their cell phones off. It's not turned off yet. But people were murdered for coming back in uniform just because they fought abroad. And the military is really interesting institution, because African Americans have fought and died for this country since the Revolutionary War. We fought in every single war. The military was the first institution to officially desegregate, and it was an institution that allowed African Americans to have stability of jobs, being able to be promoted. It was a struggle, and a lot of that struggle sort of not only mirrored the larger society, but often led the way in terms of progress in the larger society. Sports. I'm not into sports at all, I have to say. And this gallery is fabulous because I didn't think I was going to like it, and most people would think it's a sports hall of fame. And I remember when the museum opened and the first time I walked through this gallery, I read every single label, and I was really fascinated because our curator, he did not want this to be a who's who of sports, but he really wanted to talk about sports as a vehicle to talk about the greater American society. So it wasn't just about, Satchel Paige, being a great sportsman, but how his presence changed the way people saw African Americans and how great sports figures can change politics and culture. And people talk about sports as a great unifier. So maybe you might have differences of opinion, but everybody comes and watches the Super Bowl. And even as recent as today, this idea of protest during sports, and that brings people together and moves people apart. But I think it's a really great thing because it's tradition in African American culture to use this national and international platform to make people's lives better. And I think that Damien, who's our sports curator, does a really excellent job in really teasing out the complexities of sports in a way that I can appreciate, so I imagine other people can appreciate it as well who aren't sports fans. Cultural expressions. Now we're on my floor. This is the 4th floor of the museum, and if you do come and you haven't gone, I would really suggest you start off at the 4th floor and see the art gallery, because sometimes people start off with the history galleries, and it's really exhausting, it's emotional. And then you eat our lunch in our fabulous cafe, which is heavily Southern and very heavy, and it's delicious, but by the time you get to the 4th floor, sometimes people are exhausted. But this is the greatest floor. And so when you walk in, we have cultural expressions that deals with, sort of melds all aspects of culture, be it foodways, poetry, craftsmanship. If you look and you see that red coat that's from Dookie Chase's restaurant, the chef's her jacket when you wear when you are back in the kitchen, talking about hair, we're talking about this idea of colorism and skin. We have actually a brown paper bag test, which some people would use to let you into a club or fraternity. If you're light enough, you can come in. If you're too dark, you can't. And fashion. All kinds of things are melded into this gallery, and it's also a place for gathering, as you can see with the benches. Musical Crossroads. This is my best friend's exhibition, Tuan Reese. And again, just like sports, people are going to think you're going to see jazz, blues, R&B, pop. But she's a classical. She's trained as a classical musician. She's actually a singer. She sings opera. I always talk about what a nerd she is, but she really wanted to talk about the unexpected and expected stories. So she not only talks about the things like the mothership from Parliament Funkadelic, but she also talks about Black classical musicians and folk musicians and things of that nature that really sort of peel back those layers of complexity of Black musicianship. I mean, I actually played the cello and bass guitar in college, so you know, people have various interests. And one of the things I found really interesting about this exhibition is that she was really interested in having a record shop, which is now historic, unless maybe, or the fact that young people don't know what records look like. And I think most of us went to the record shop and thumbing through, and now it's an historical sort of document. And it's really interesting to see young people go and learn about records and how people listen to them and how tactile music was, when now you just download it on your MP3 player, your iPod, or whatever. Taking the stage, so this documents the history of African American contributions to stage, theater, television, movies, dance, etc. And what you've all come to see is the Visual Arts Gallery, which I think is the greatest gallery in the museum. So, why did we have a visual arts gallery in the History and Culture Museum? As far as I'm aware, we're the only History and Culture Museum that has a dedicated visual arts gallery that actually looks like a gallery you would find in a museum. So a lot of history museums that do have art, but it's often used in support of a historical narrative and not showing art as, a form of expression in and of itself. Our director and our deputy director, Kinshasha Holman Conwell, really felt it was important to feature art. And I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it, but when you walk into the museum, you see 3 fabulous works of art by Richard Hunt, Jakaya Booker, and Sam Gilliam, all of which are abstract artists, which is something that you would not normally expect when you walk into an African American museum. But we really wanted to make a statement as soon as you walked in the door that visual arts are central to this museum. And the fact is, the first curator they hired was a visual art curator. I think speaks volumes to the commitment that our leadership had to promoting and supporting the visual and fine arts. So when Jackie Sorer, Dr. Sorer, who is our chief curator, and myself embarked upon creating this gallery, we really had to think. Both of us were American art curators. We both worked at traditional art museums. Neither one of us specialized in art by African Americans. And we've never really worked in a history and culture museum. So initially we were going to do the traditional art museum that sort of starts from the beginning and moves up through different movements and phases. And then we really had to think, we're not dealing with a traditional art audience. Many people, I would say 25% of people who've come to our museum has never stepped foot in a museum before. and you know more than that have never been to an art museum, because art museums are historically not welcoming to your average person. People don't feel, because our arts programs in schools are not really quite robust, that they know what they're doing, and it's very elitist. And we were trying to figure out a way, when we thought that we were in a new museum. We were at the Smithsonian, so most people go to the Smithsonian. They might not have art museums in their hometown. This is their first time going, so they go to all of these museums. So it's not even unusual for the Smithsonian not to have people who go to art museums at home, or have access to art museums at home, or able to afford to go to museums at home, to come to this DC where all of the museums are free. So, you know, how do we make that happen, and how do we deal with our own special audience? Well, one of the things as American historians that we thought was extremely important, and one of the first things we decided to do, was not call art by Black people Black art and African American art. And I am in the minority in feeling this way. A lot of my colleagues don't agree, and we have really deep discussions about this. But as an Americanist, I realized that the only artwork that we talk about in terms of race are art by people who aren't white. So you have Latino American art, Asian American art, African American art, and then we have art. And what that does is define a production of art by people based upon the color of their skin. And that is not an art movement. That is not an art style. And when I was doing research on art from the 18th century to the present, the one through line that we had is that artists consistently said they did not want to be called a Black artist. Not that they were denying their Blackness, but they wanted to just be an artist or an American artist. And I think that's fair, and we wanted to honor that. It's not to say that all artists felt that way, because all artists don't. I mean, I know artists personally who say I'm a Black artist who creates Black art for Black people. But I will have to say that's the minority. And a lot of museums will define their collections of art by Black people as Black art. And so for me, my definition of Black art is art with Black paint. And I stand by that, and my boss stands by that too. So that's revolutionary for us. And I think that sometimes, you know, we really have to think about that, because we're an African American museum. So how do you rectify that? Well, I rectify it as our mission is to talk about art through the lens, or history through the lens of the African American experience. So that's not to say that even though our entire gallery is filled with artwork by Black people, that's not the only type of art that we collect. We have a much broader range of artists. We do collect artwork by artists who are not Black that also document aspects of the African American experience or race in America. We wanted to also show work by artists who have not been accepted by so-called mainstream America. We thought this was important because of the history of racism in this country. Artists were not supported, and Black artists weren't supported in the way that their compatriots were. So you're not going to get a Whitney to say, like Jackson Pollock, okay, we think you have talent, you don't have to work, we're going to pay for you to just do work for a year. And then a gallery is going to pick you up, or Clement Greenberg is going to start writing about you and saying that you're the best thing since sliced bread. And this is how the art world works. If you have to work 2 jobs, you're not going to be creating a lot of work. If you're not going to be patronized, you're not going to have the opportunity or space or money just to work on your work. If a gallery is not going to take you because you're Black, you're not going to be able to sell your work. If patrons aren't going to buy you because you're Black, you're not going to come down in history. And if museums aren't going to show you because you're Black, chances are you won't be remembered. And we understand that history, and we're going to do the best we can to help rectify that. So we will collect artists that have been, well, let me put it this way. There's an artist called Norman Lewis who has received a lot of attention. One of the curators from the National Gallery of Art put together this fabulous exhibition of this abstract artist. And he was written about, and they said that he was underappreciated and unknown. I grew up knowing Norman Lewis, and everybody I knew thought he was the greatest artist, and he is a great artist, and I was shocked that people didn't know who he was, because it's not as if people didn't appreciate him. Black people who loved art always appreciated him. He was unknown because white people didn't know who he was. And now that he's discovered, he's famous, and we can't afford to have a Norman Lewis. But I think that what we want to do is collect art by people who have been marginalized, and we understand that. And some of the art we actually have collected has raised the profile of this artist from completely unknown to something that people are paying attention to, and we're really, really proud of that. And the last thing is to be safe. So in the beginning, I'm talking about how sometimes art museums are very intimidating to people. So we did some things when we created this art gallery to really let people feel like they don't have to know anything about art to enjoy this art collection. And I had a question earlier today when I was giving a talk to some of these young people in the Johnson Gallery, and one of them said, how would you suggest that as a non-art person, what should I do when I come into a museum? Should I read the text? Should I look at the art? How should I react? And it was such a good question. And no one's ever asked that to me before. And I said, whatever you want to do. If you don't want to stay because you don't like it, leave. If you want to read all the labels, you can. If you don't like it, you know, sometimes the best conversations you could have when you come home and you go see your show is how much you didn't like that art and why you didn't like that art, or how much you loved it and why you didn't love it. What I want people to do is come in, feel like their opinion matters, and I'm not telling them why they should like it, but I'm just letting them know why we think it's important. So, we had some challenges. So as I said, our budget was around $1.2 million for the entire museum. I really couldn't ask for more than $150,000 because I couldn't take away all the money from all the other exhibitions. And art is the single most expensive area to collect in the entire museum. So what we would do is front load our ass as soon as that fiscal year passed. We put up the most expensive artworks where everybody else was like, okay, you know, they felt free, but you waited till the end of the fiscal year. People want to know how much money was left in the budget, and sometimes you wouldn't get really expensive artworks passed beyond our collection committee. So what did we do in order to get artworks that are considered Smithsonian worthy? Because regardless of our budget, we had to collect great works of art. So we relied upon donations. And you do have really famous and extensive collectors, but what really surprised me was the number of people who just collected because they liked it. They put it in their homes. They never told anybody they had it, but collectors, like people who, you know, are interested in trains, or people have a community. And I would go to one person's home, I would give my spiel that I just gave you about how we're going to present this art, and they would buy into it. And it was great because this museum didn't exist. An art gallery in a history museum was unheard of. Nobody knew what it was going to be like, but people believed in our vision. They gave us works that we could use, and then they would tell their friends to welcome me in their home and support our museum. We had a very limited space. So when I was at the Dayton Art Institute, my permanent gallery was 12,500 square feet of space, and our temporary exhibition space was 10,500. So 3,800 square feet of space was very challenging, and we had to hang what I call a very cozy collection. And we decided to really group the narrative in our exhibition not by here's abstraction, here's 19th century landscape, here's postmodernism, but we used thematic terms that we felt that everybody could relate to. I think I've covered this one. Oh, the other thing that we did was we insisted on extended wall labels for every work of art. So I'm sure all of you're here because you're interested in art, you've been to art galleries that sometimes don't explain what postmodern deconstruction theory is, even though they might say it and expect you to understand. So we felt it was important that if you were confused and didn't know why it was there, that every single label had extended text, and that as often as we could, we would quote the artist if possible, so that people could hear that voice. It's much more interesting than hearing my voice of why I think it's important, but it's lovely to hear why an artist thinks it's important. So, and I wish, let me see if I can do, okay, well, I'm unable to do the pointer, but this is a really compressed map of our gallery, but really when you think about it, you enter with this sort of circular vestibule to the entrance, and then you can go 2, 3, and then when you get to this point, it's a very long gallery. So what you see on the top actually fits above 7. So 8 and 9 fit above 7. And so we have various titles of each gallery. So New Materials, New Worlds is about artists using non-traditional materials. The Beauty of Color and Form is really the abstract gallery. Religion and spirituality, we did themes that we thought might resonate, particularly with African Americans. African connections, that's a very particular subject that African American artists were interested in, well, some of them. The politics of identity, that still pretty much resonates strongly in the world. The struggle for freedom, the world around us. And then we have a very small changing exhibition gallery. So when you enter the exhibition, this is what you see. And you see the title and explanation of what this gallery is about. This is a beautiful William T. Williams. This is an excellent example of the fact that William T. Williams, and he knows this, so I'm not speaking out of school, but he is a famous abstract painter, and he is really finally getting his due. A lot of abstract artists during the 50s and 60s were ignored just because they were Black, not because their artwork was bad. And we really wanted this particular style of work. It looks a lot like Frank Stella. He was working at the same time, but we couldn't afford it. And he told me that, I asked him how much it was, we couldn't afford it, and he was like, Swan Auction is selling it. I know I'm not gonna get the price that it sells to retail. I was like, oh yeah, Swan Auction is selling? Well, that's where we got this piece. And he asked Swan to tell him who bought it, and I was like, well, it's gonna be public knowledge, you might as well tell him. And I knew he was gonna be kind of mad, but this is the only way we can afford it. And so to make it up to him, I decided to put it in the entrance, so once he saw it, he would be happy, and he was very, very happy. So when you walk in, this is a gallery, New Materials, New Worlds. And we have certain pieces. That piece, the Blue Horse, which is called Blue Horse, is by a local artist. We believe in not only supporting national artists, but a lot of museums, particularly in DC, feel a little bit funny about buying local artists. It might seem like favoritism or whatnot. But, knowing for a long time that DC artists weren't necessarily always patronized by the Smithsonian, we really wanted to patronize this artist, and we knew that children would really love this piece. And it's a life-size horse that the artist, he got into art because as a child, he rode his bicycle off some rocky cliff, boys, and really hurt himself and was in the hospital for months. Before cable, before iPads, and what did he do? He had to draw. And so all of his pieces deal with issues of transportation, and they often have bicycle motifs. And then this large piece called The Mothership is clearly the Mercury spaceship. So we wanted to sort of key into other aspects, not only of the Smithsonian and art history, but other places in the museum. It's called Mothership, and so it's a really interesting piece. It actually plays music from Stevie Wonder and Sun Ra, and part of Obama's speech where he talks about Kennedy talking about, he really wanted to invest money in coming to the moon in the space race, and he remembers that as a child, and the artist was a big Star Trek fan, an Afrofuturist fan, and this idea that in the future race doesn't matter. And we have Lieutenant Uhura's dress from Star Trek, and we have Parliament Funkadelic's Mothership, which you saw earlier when I saw we did the music gallery. So here are these more close up, and then Melvin Edwards' piece, Lynch Fragment. And then the fun thing we decided to do was talk about works in our collection that mirror works in the Johnson's collection. So this is our piece by Thornton Dial, and anything you see with the light blue writing is a piece from the Johnson collection. So what I thought was really interesting when I was putting this this PowerPoint together is how closely a lot of our works mirror, and how sometimes I'm quite jealous that they have works that we don't have. So I thought I'd talk about that. Our second gallery is the Beauty of Color and Form, which again essentially is our abstraction gallery. And extended wall labels are really important at this gallery, because most people look at something, they don't see anything that they recognize, and they feel, a little put off. But we make sure that people understand why that's important, and actually more importantly, we talk about why the artist did it. So in that piece in the center that looked like the target, that's by Alma Thomas, and one of the things we talked about by her is that she was a representational artist, and then she had a huge issue with arthritis, and she thought she'd never paint again. And then she decided to do this style, which made her famous. And she is considered one of the greatest Washington color field painters there are. And we were so pleased, and this is an example of a work of art that a donor gave us. They did not necessarily want to give it, but I insisted and I begged and pleaded, and he finally relented and not only gave this piece, became a $1 million donor. And the piece in the center, Mavis Pusey, she's an example of an artist that I'd never heard of before. So I don't know all of these artists, but I saw her at an auction, saw this work at an auction, and it was beautiful. And I said, who is she? It was created in '68. And here's a Black woman who's creating work on par with any abstract painter of the time. And I think she won a Krasner Award, I want to say. I may be wrong, don't quote me on that. But she was working in a man's world, and she was not recognized. And we bought this piece, and as I am told, or as I hear, now the Studio Museum of Harlem is going to do a solo show of hers. So I had no idea who she was, but I recognized her brilliance. We had to have it. We're in an institution where we can take those chances, where a lot of art museums can't. This artist needs to be proven. Who has them, what collectors have them, what museums have them, where have they shown? And we can say the first place they're going to show with that major international platform is our museum. And hopefully our mission is to bring artists that have not been appreciated, bring them to the forefront, and then where they can be. And in this gallery, we have a Beaufort Delaney, but the Johnson's collection's Beaufort Delaney is super cool. And they have two. So ours is a little smaller, and we covet theirs as well, but they're both quite beautiful. And this is a series that Beaufort Delaney did while he was living in France. I think his yellow series is the best series. And the Johnsons have two yellow paintings, and I'm so pleased. And maybe one day we can show theirs. They also have a Felred Hines. So I think that we have four, and so I want to show theirs in connection with ours as well. Our gallery, Religion and Spirituality, that's a trend I saw coming up over and over in art by African Americans. And a lot of times, popular culture, people think that African Americans are only Baptists. And of course, we are Catholics and Buddhist and Muslim and Methodist and Episcopal. And what we want to show is this broad range of religious beliefs, expand that idea that is, again, not a monolithic culture. And we wanted to talk about how artists have represented that. over time. And if you look at this piece to your left, on top we have a work by Alan Rowan Crete, and on the bottom is a work by Clementine Hunter. And so Stations of the Cross is on top. That features, of course, a white Jesus and his mother Mary. And on the bottom, the Clementine Hunter piece is called Black Jesus. This meant something to me because my grandmother's Catholic. And we all know that Jesus was neither black nor white. He was, Middle Eastern Jew. But she had all of those little figurines that Catholics have. And I remember telling my grandma, you know that Jesus wasn't white. And that's the first time she yelled at me. And she said, I couldn't believe she said that. She chastised me about that. And when I was in college, this woman, an artist who really promoted me, really sort of pushed me to go into the arts. Her father was a minister, a Southern Baptist minister, I believe, and his church commissioned her to do a mural for the church, and she made the figures black. And the church saw it, and it was his church. They rejected the mural because these figures needed to be white. And then Clementine Hunter made this black Jesus, and somebody asked her about that. And she was like, doesn't everybody know Jesus was black? So it was a really interesting to me. Sometimes I hang pieces together like that to talk about issues that not often are talked about and sort of let people think. So we have David C. Driscoll's Behold Thy Son. We do talk about religious art and religion used in the fight for against racial injustice. So David Driscoll was, I think, at Fisk at the time when Emmett Till was murdered. And he does not do political art. But a year after Emmett Till was murdered, he had his 2 young daughters with him, and he felt compelled to do this piece, Behold Thy Son, which, when Jesus was resurrected, he told his mother, Behold Thy Son, and he's on the cross, and in the back you see a menorah, and you also see the casket. And so that's all about likening the idea that the death and resurrection of Christ was the beginning of Christianity. And when Emmett Till was murdered and his mother had that open casket funeral, that was a catalyst, strong catalyst for the civil rights movement. And that's why we had it on the wall where we had other pieces that dealt with art, dealing with religion and the civil rights movement. And it's really interesting, I don't know if any of you have heard, but there was this piece by an artist named Dana Schultz that was at the Whitney that showed Emmett Till in his casket, and she was a white artist, and it was this huge ordeal. How dare she co-opt our history? These artists really sort of protested. And we really had issue with that at our museum because it's not our history, it's the world's history, and Emmett Till changed things for everyone. And that's why his mother said, I want people to see what they did to my son. I want everybody to see it. And that really changed. And we don't believe that anybody owns any part of history. And I was surprised, and one of the biggest issues was they said, and how dare she sell it? She hadn't sold it, but we bought the piece by David Driscoll. And I mean, they're artists. This is what they do, and they make statements. So it's really important. And then the work on the far end, the glass piece, is Buddha. And I thought that was really interesting because, of course, there are Black Buddhists as well. And here's our Minnie Evans, and Minnie Evans in the Johnson collection. She was a visionary artist. She had these dreams, and she was compelled to create this art. And a lot of it had symbolism, sort of the eyes of God. And she had all of these flora and fauna in her works. And I was really surprised at how close those pieces are to one another as well. And our Clementine Hunter. We have, I think, 20-something pieces by Clementine Hunter. And we have a show that's up now, Clementine Hunter, Life on Melrose Plantation. This is a really interesting piece, speaking of religion, because what you see in the background is a Catholic church, but she was Catholic, but she enjoyed going to Baptist churches because there was much more fun and communal activities and all of that. And so what you see in the baptism is, because I was like, I did not know Catholics baptize people in the river. Well, they don't. So she did a lot of conflation between Catholicism and the Baptist religion. So even though, you see this baptism, it was because she went to both churches until the Catholic Church says you can't go to both. So then she had to go just to the Catholic Church. Our African Connections Gallery is really interesting because if you think about the New Negro movement, it was the first time where African American artists were told by W.E.B. Du Bois and Charles Spurgeon Johnson and Elaine Locke that they should really be looking toward their African heritage as inspiration for art. And that's when it was called Negro art. But there was no such thing as Negro art or Black art until the 20s. Before that, it was just art, and there were no Black artists. When you saw that piece, that landscape by Duncanson was just an artist. There was no Black art, and it was a made-up concept. But Elaine Locke thought that was very important because African art was one of the bedrocks of the formation of European modernism. It was a way to break free of what we call the mimetic tradition, right? So once photography came into vogue, you didn't need a portrait artist to create your portrait. You can actually use a photograph. So what do you do with art when you can take a picture of a landscape instead of having to paint a landscape? Where do you go? And people started looking at Asian art, Indian art, and African art as a way to break free from the traditional European models of creating art. And, Elaine Locke said, if Picasso can do it, we can do it too. So there were phases that went through in terms of African Americans' understanding of their own cultural heritage. And Black artists really didn't go to Africa until generally the 50s. John Biggers was the first artist to go, mainly because it was expensive. It was a long trip, and so even art before that tended to be it looked like European art, and that's what people were looking at. We were looking at African masks in the same way that Picasso was, but there's also this greater sense of heritage. So it's not just we're trying to move into a modernist aesthetic, but it means something to us because that's where we come from, and it's about sort of reconnecting with an African past that I will say is unique to Black artists. And here are some pieces. The Aaron Douglas, he was one of the earliest artists to go to a diasporic country, and he went to Haiti. And this is interesting. I mean, you have two Douglases in your collection, but he was on a Rosenwald Fellowship. And when you look at this piece, this looks like any other piece. It doesn't look like a Black artist did it. And he actually went there to paint Negro types in a way that you would think, okay, there's a Black artist, go to paint Negro types. But he was going as a privileged Black person. And when he came back, he showed it a famous gallery, ACA Gallery, should still exist. And when Elaine Locke saw it, he was so disappointed because this is post-impressionism and it's like tourist art. But then you have an artist like Azure Cowens. This is a piece called Soweto, Soweto. And he's an artist as a member of AfriCobra, the African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists, which is the longest lived to this day artist collective in the United States of America. And it started in 1969, and they just added a new member last year. And it was an exhibition to show solidarity, what was going on in Soweto and the student uprising and massacre. And then Floyd Coleman, Shango's helper, which is a really more abstract way of looking at African art. So you're not just looking at masks and reproducing them. Now you're looking at the culture, and you're understanding how art functions in African culture. And it's not just putting a mask in a sterile environment in a museum, but it's really looking at Yoruba culture and what that means. So this is a Yoruba Orisha, and I can't go really into it, but it's very symbolic. And it's not something that you would, a Yoruba Orisha is like, I would guess, like Zeus and Hera are in terms of Greek mythology, right? And so Hera is the goddess of the hearth, and Shango's helpeth is Oya, and she's the goddess of tornadoes and dynamism. And if you have a problem, you'll go to her and she'll help you right the wrong that somebody did to you. And that's why she's carrying a saber and her color is red, and her husband is Shango, which is represented with this double axe on top. So you kind of have to know what you're looking at, but if you don't, it's beautiful. The politics of identity. This is really important when I'm talking about this idea of pigeonholing Black artists. It's a very complex history. So when you talk about the New Negro movement, there's this idea that all Black artists bought into that. Very few artists wanted to be considered a Negro artist, and very few people understood even what that was. So when Elaine Locke wrote his book, Modern Negro Art, not Modern Negro Art, that was James Porter, but when he was talking about creating this aesthetic, he brought in a German artist to teach Black artists how to do Black art. So, because there was no such thing, and Wynald Reese taught Aaron Douglas how to do Black art, if that's not something that's quite shocking. And so we talk about this gallery, about how identity is imposed on you internally, how it's imposed on you externally, how artists see themselves, and how artists express themselves through various means of aesthetic production. So in the center is my proudest moment. That's Meta Vowerk Fuller's Ethiopia. This is considered the first Pan-African artwork ever created. And she was a classically trained artist. She studied in Paris. She was a great fan of Rodin, visited his studio and met him. And W.E.B. Du Bois and Charles Spurgeon Johnson, they were in charge of an exhibition called America. There was an exposition in New York called America's Making, about how different migrant groups helped shape this country, which again is interesting given the climate we are in today. And one of the sections was on the American Negro. And they wanted to commission a piece that really reflected this new Negro. And it was this idea of a woman emerging from her confines of the mummified rags. And it's called Ethiopia, even when you would think that was Egyptian. Ethiopia at the time was strongly conflated with Egypt, and Ethiopia was the only country in Africa that wasn't colonized. That was very, very important. And she had never done this style before, but they asked her, told her exactly what to do, and this piece was thought to be lost for decades. And her niece called us up one day and said, we'd like to donate it. And she ran up there within a week. We were at her house picking out the works, and this is one of our most significant works of art. And when you see the piece Amy Sherrill, this is another example of the fact that we don't need an artist to be famous. So when I first saw this piece, I was at a gallery for a tea, drinking tea, and it was a social gathering. I saw this piece on the wall, couldn't stop staring at it, couldn't stop staring at it, couldn't stop staring at it. I asked who the artist was. Her name was Amy Sherrill. She was a young artist, not well known. She had a couple pieces that were donated to the Women's Museum, but again, not a large body of work, but I did look at her webpage. I said, this woman's gonna do something. And I decided I want to buy it because it really works into this idea of identity. And she talks about being a young Black woman at one of the only young Black women growing up in her school, and how she felt that she had to put on a role, and this mask that she had to wear, and this performance that she had to do. And so this is not a self-portrait, but she talks about that, and that resonated with me because I was often the only one in my school, and people don't really talk about what that means to be the representative Black. So I really loved this piece even before I knew the story. And famously, she became the artist who painted Mrs. Obama's portrait. And if we were to buy this now, we couldn't. It's good to get them young, And the piece to your right, Rashid Johnson's also quite famous, but this was his first series that put him on the map. And he went around and took pictures of people who, I don't think he likes to call them homeless, but they're essentially homeless, and that you just don't see anymore. You don't see them as human, but what this man is telling you is that he's a man, and he's a highly religious man. So that's his identity, and it's an identity that we don't see because these people are displaced. And so here's our portrait of James Porter, and he is considered the father of African American art history. He was chair of the department at Howard University, a professor of David Driscoll's. He was very interested in documenting the history of African American artists, and he wrote the book Modern Negro Art. And here's the painting, and that painting is fabulous, owned by the Johnson Collection. And this is an excellent example of an artist who is creating a painting that is elevating art from African ancestry. So you see the mask in the front, you see his still life painting in the back, and what looks like an African fabric behind that mask. And this is the first time I've seen it, and I was very, very impressed. And I actually organized his papers for his widow. Huey Lee Smith. This is also in the politics of identity, and this is an example of an artist who really lamented the fact that he was always considered a black artist. He was raised in Cleveland in an integrated environment. He worked with other famous artists, but he was always that black artist pushed to the side. And you see this, he's really working in a surrealist, European surrealist vein, and you see this sense of isolation, like a Giacometti or something like that, or De Chirico. And we quote him in terms of talking about a quote about being isolated as a black artist. And so his best work is during the 50s and 60s in this idea of emptiness. And it just really is haunting. And we had to have that work, and we have one that I just saw today as well. The struggle for freedom, and this is the idea of how artists have really expressed various ways of freedom, not only in terms of political freedom, but individual freedom, etc. And this is a piece that was a donation to Jacob Lawrence Dixie Cafe. Jacob Lawrence was born in the North. He spent all of his life there, but at some point he went down south, and it was a harrowing experience for him. He had not experienced segregation. I think he went to Black Mountain College when he was going, and he was doing a series. He's working with Langston Hughes on a book of poetry, where he created drawings of just like this. I think it was a part of the series that wasn't put in the book. And we have this quote from a Jim Crow law about how if you're going to have black and white people in a cafe, they have to have separate entrances, they have to have a barrier, has to be at least 6 feet tall. I mean, it was a ridiculous amount of rules just so you can have black and white people eat in the same building. And so we used that Jim Crow law, and we quote that, and that's some of the ways that we could connect with the segregation exhibition. And then Kara Walker's No World, dealing with the Middle Passage and a number of people who passed away during that journey. And we also have our Charles White. So originally we had that Charles White on that wall I talked about in the religion gallery, in terms of art that uses religion to fight for civil rights. And this piece, Move On Up a Little Higher, made famous by Mahalia Jackson, was originally written by a pastor as a freedom protest song. And he stated, I think it was in the 40s, that he wrote that song as a protest song, but you can't say anything, so it was a covert religious kind of thing. But Mahalia Jackson made it famous and was able to bring it to popular culture as a protest song. And then we have the Johnson Collection, I Have a Dream, number 11. And so one of the things that we have in our gallery is pieces can go in multiple places, so Move On Up a Little Higher could have easily gone in our Struggle for Freedom gallery as well as religion. And the world around us. This is a gallery that essentially deals with still life, genre, and portraiture, and landscape. And this is the type of art that most people love. I do too. So we have Augusta Savage. Gammon, which is owned by the Johnson Collection, is probably her most famous work. She was not just an artist, but a teacher. She taught young people. She had a studio in Harlem. She was extremely talented, but at some point she was so dejected about the racism and the sexism and the fact that she couldn't make her way as an artist in the world that she destroyed most of the works in her studio. So very few exist. This is a piece that we bought at auction. I had never seen it before, Nude Torso, and it's done in a very neoclassical style. And although you wouldn't know, it is a black woman, is one of her students that she used as a model. It's quite a beautiful piece. This is R. Hell Woodruff. I was very happy to see that the Johnson Collection purchased a Hell Woodruff that is abstract. Most museums will only purchase representational art so that their public will know that they have a diverse collection. And I actually did speak from a woman from Christie's who told me when museums come to buy art by black artists, they want it to be visibly black. And he was a great abstract painter, but no museums buy his abstract work, but a lot of private collectors do. And we have a quote by him: even though these pieces look totally abstract, he does state that everything I do is grounded in reality. And he taught at the Atlanta University Center. He taught many, that's why you have it in the show, because he taught at Spelman and Clark Atlanta University and trained so many people, and he worked in so many different styles. This is a style that I greatly admired, and it was also a landscape, and I put it in there to let people know that over time, landscapes aren't just something that you recognize, but it changes as art styles change as well. And this is R. Joshua Johnson, the portrait of John Westwood. We know that there was a portrait of his wife probably at some time, but we don't know where that is. But there is a portrait of John Westwood's children, very famous at the National Gallery of Art. And then Johnson's Hilmer Schumacher, and they do have the wife. But I just decided to put both of them in there. And then our changing gallery. So right now we have the Clementine Hunter exhibition there, but this gallery was the first exhibition, Myth, Memory, and Reality, that we had in that space. And finally, one of the other ways that we want visitors to sort of gain a greater understanding is we have this gallery interactive where you can look up an artist, and even if you don't know a lot about art, so let's just say you looked up that piece, move on up a little higher, you find out who wrote that song, you found out its place in history as music, you learn more about Charles White as a person, and you also learn that he's not working in this black arts vacuum. So one of the things that we wanted, our mission is we can only show black artists in this gallery, but if you look at somebody like Joshua Johnson, he was the first professional black artist that we know of, but he was working a style that all artists at that time worked of, and is a limner style. And we wanted to show these artists in the greater community, which you can't see in our gallery, but we just didn't want people to think that just all black artists work together with other black artists and they're not looking at the greater art world or anything like that, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. And I want to end by this quote by Charles Alston, and I think it sums up our gallery very well. And he writes, "I don't believe there's such thing as black art, though there's certainly been a black experience. I've lived it, but it's also an American experience." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tuliza. I hope y'all enjoyed her as much as I did. In closing, we have a brief appearance that I hope you'll enjoy. Some years ago, I saw a notice in our local paper about a meeting that was going to be held, and it was called Speaking Down Barriers. It was a meeting that was going to be held in a church, and it talking about hard truths in our community and our country. I'm a lover of language, so when I heard that title, Speaking Down Barriers, I didn't know what it meant, but I decided I would go, and I went by myself, and I sat very quietly and listened. And that was the first time I had heard the voice and the wisdom of a woman named Miranda Deacon. I've been listening to her words ever since, and I hope you'll listen to them tonight with pleasure. Her poet name is Sapient Soul, and I give to you Sapient Soul. I don't know where she is.
Dr. Tuliza Fleming, I'm not sure where she went, but thank you very much. And to the Johnson family, thank you, thank you, thank you. Black history is as a kid, I hated Black History Month. I knew there would be something like a play, a few poems, some songs or Negro spirituals, and I knew that I would have to be nice to kids who on most days were my bullies. I hated that this celebration seemed to always have some forced undercurrent agenda of seeking to bring us all together. Our teachers trying to make unity and respect among our many shades of black. Meanwhile, our principal was drunk and walking the hallways. I went to a school with hard and strong children who would nail you in the eye with a baseball and then laugh at the way your body hit the ground, and I thought I was different and somehow better than them. Those bad kids or those rough kids or those crack baby kids. And amongst so much dysfunction, there was that damn Black History Month celebration every year as if nothing was wrong. Where Miss Nelson would sing, I've had some good days. And we all would attempt, we shall overcome. After we were told over and over that we were the descendants of strong slaves. In one of the plays, I was Madam C.J. Walker. She had invented hair products specific to black hair. So there I was in a weird dress, holding a jar of blue magic in my hand, and I absolutely hated it. Somehow, I was learning to hate myself among all these mirrors of myself. It is crazy how oppression can crack mirrors. I was learning to hate myself because no one had articulated to me who we were before slavery, before brutalization, before babies were murdered and families were torn apart to build this country and give it a backbone to stand with. Even as young as 8 years old, I knew that telling children like me over and over again how lucky we were to not be slaves was an incomplete picture. Who were we that were packed like cargo, some dead and some alive, traveling across the ocean to a field of blood? There are bodies buried beneath houses in Charleston. There are black and brown bodies buried beneath houses in Charleston. There are stolen black and brown bodies buried beneath the houses and streets of the beautiful and wealthy Charleston, South Carolina. Deep inside, I wanted to know who we were before chattel, before property, before our babies were alligator food and our partners were strange fruits swinging from trees. But there I was, acting as Madam C.J. Walker. I had never heard about Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president unbought and unbossed, or Marcus Garvey, who imagined a nation where we might find liberation. Instead, I had been taught to project myself as the acceptable black girl. So while the energy of Ida B. Wells, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and Harriet Tubman traveled through me, it was being silenced by a play of politeness around who we really are as black. Surviving and thriving people within a country that has stolen everything it has ever owned. But today, I do not hate Black History Month. Today I just find it funny, ironic. Last February, a 16-year-old girl from a Spartanburg school had her history teacher tell her that Black History Month is racist. In February, a 16-year-old from Spartanburg, South Carolina, had her history teacher tell her that Black History Month is racist. A 16-year-old child who attends a South Carolina school had her history teacher tell her that Black History Month is racist. This happens in the same state where the State House Confederate flag was traded in for 9 lives during the summer of 2015. This is what I mean when I say ironic. I find it ironic that here we are, still trying to learn that Black history is world history. Black history is world history. Black history is world history, and the human beings brought to build this nation should matter to every person that has ever touched its soil. But somewhere, there is a 16-year-old girl explaining this to her history teacher. Somewhere, there is a child dressing up like Madam C.J. Walker, and all due respect to Madam C.J. Walker. But I pray that someone tells this little girl about all that our Black history offers her. Ashe.
Thank you, Marlanda, for sharing your gift with us tonight. I also want to reiterate the collection's thanks to Dr. Tuliza Fleming for her visit and message. 2.5 years after its opening, the National Museum of African American History and Culture remains the most coveted ticket in Washington, D.C. The power and pull of that institution underscores the message President Barack Obama delivered at its opening, noting that the museum reaffirms that all of us are American, that African American history is not somehow separate from our larger American story. And it's not the underside of the American story. It is central to the American story. Please give your attention to the back of your program and the information printed there about the exhibition currently on view at TJC Gallery. Curated by artist, educator, and our great friend, Dr. Leo Twiggs, Elevation from Within, the study of art at historically Black colleges and university, pays homage to HBCU alumni and professors whose educational backgrounds chronicle a vital chapter of American history and whose aesthetic achievements have made an indelible mark on this nation's art. While the show runs through mid-May, 2 special gallery events occur in April and March, and I hope you'll join us for those gatherings. Thank you for your presence this evening, and now please enjoy the refreshments in the lobby and take an opportunity to greet Dr. Fleming.